Chris?
No, absolutely. Thank you, both Shirlivy and Reggie. Awesome presentation. Again, touching on those main points and that summary, um, PowerPoint at the end, or that summary slide, I should say. I have a lot of really good questions, and I feel like, some of these can kind of, be bunched together as it relates just the overall kind of dynamic, right? Um, Getting into those RAF scores and identifying kind of your benchmarking on that, how does one kind of gather that information? What's the best way to do that? Is that something, where you're involved with either, insurance providers, your ACOs, things of that nature, or where can really one set the benchmark as it relates to capturing what a true RAF score would be, in current state, and figuring out what manners they put in place to really move those scores?
Uh, Chris, we use a tool to capture our RAF scores. We use an Optum tool, and we partner with some of our population health folks. So how we move our RAF score is looking at our HCCs, right? And we went through that process about the chart reviews that are done by our CDI team. And how we focus in on HCCs, but we also ensure that we only query on HCCs that have not been captured within that calendar year. And I know Reggie actually is the one that pulls those RAF scores for us through the Optum tool that we use. So I don't know if you had anything additional to add to the RAF score capture.
I know a little bit more about it, but it gets fairly technical. So it's easier just to go with your answer, is that we get it from Optum by running a report from Optum. But suffice it to say that they compile data from all across the country, and then they add these different HCCs in, and they can kind of give you what your RAF score is, and you can set a reasonable goal for improvement on your RAF scores.
Yeah.
Got it. Perfect. So ultimately utilizing some of the tools that one may have in place just to inquire with, some of their providers as it relates to any software component or anything as it relates to, audit services that may be able to kind of alleviate having to find that information out, from scratch, and really leveraging maybe what information we can gather,
Yeah,
internally from
they
any
they
department.
have tools and you can calculate it manually and stuff, but it does get pretty far down into the weeds. We actually have some people on our team that can do it and could walk you through the entire thing, but we took their word for it and we just worked on the improving the capture of the HCCs to improve our RAF scores.
And Chris, yes, I can calculate a RAF score manually too. So I was going to say, for those of you who don't have a product that will calculate your RAF score for you, if maybe you're starting from scratch, if you have some type of database that you're going to use, when you're creating that database, if you put in the risk score for that particular diagnosis in that database, you can use the formula to calculate it. That would be the first part of the formula, right? And then of course there's the other demographic piece of your RAF score in it. So if you capture age, there are certain things you could put in the database. I'm happy to talk to anyone who has more questions about either the manual capture of a formula and something you can enter into your database if you don't have all these tools. We're fortunate to have a tool, but there are certain parameters you can add, like in the manual database, if it is something like Access or Tableau that can assist you in capturing a score, at least to give you an idea of how you're trending. It would be better if you had a software, but I can understand if you're in your infancy stages that may not be doable.
Got it. And would you suggest too, kind of aligning, I think, which was the first point, right? If one was in that manner of more of that manual approach and kind of compiling that database, really taking a look at maybe, the targeted patient population they would like to take a look at first, since that would be a little bit manual, and kind of baby stepping it from there, as it relates to kind of growing upon that, maybe only focusing on that certain patient population initially, so you wouldn't necessarily get overwhelmed, and just really starting to kind of see the breadcrumbs turn into, larger portions, if you will.
I think you would have to, Chris,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
because it would be so manual to calculate every single RAF score.
Right. No, and hey, look, that makes sense, and I think those are the questions to where, again, internally, what tools and resources, does one have in play? And then ultimately, what's a good starting point based off some of those questions and qualifiers, right? And then really ultimately kind of, taking it one step at a time from there. But I think, again, that targeted approach and just figuring out what tools and resources maybe, one may have at their disposal is initially kind of a good step if you're talking about, infancy stages. And kind of on that topic, anything as it relates to your all settings that maybe would make, the clinic setting a little bit easier or harder than maybe the ED setting as it relates to, maybe starting that process or, quantifying results I'm sure that would depend on the health system primarily, but still, if you had to pick one over the other, is there any better pros or cons on where to start from what you've seen from your success?
In my opinion, the outpatient clinic is going to give you better bang for your buck. And since that process has a little bit more lead time, you're not against the wall as much on your time frame. And even in our case, it's also harder to determine the HCCs of a patient when they're in the ED. So that adds an added layer of complexity. In our particular case, since we were focusing on that MSSP population, it's not right in your face about seeing whether they had an HCC recorded and that sort of thing in the EMR. And it's not something that the physicians are really worried too much about when they come for the ER visit. So I would say outpatient clinic would be your best focus if you have to choose one.
Right. And you'd say that too as well, Shirley, just kind of really focusing on that area. I would imagine because they're prospective queries, right? You can probably put a process a little bit easier in place, or at least have a better understanding and kind of limit it to that side.
Yeah, and even your payer mix in the ED, our volume is very low when we're talking about Medicare risk. The volume is greater on the clinic side, and I would imagine that to be true in most organizations. So 100% clinic, yeah.
Gotcha. And then, just kind of diving a little bit deeper on that ER side, is that something where, primary focus, on those HCCs, or is there other areas that you all are focusing on, such as, level of care, big one that we've seen on the charge master side, infusion and injections, right, start and stop times, kind of, all of those things. Was that almost the overall approach as it relates to the ED attack, or have you all turned on kind of enhancements as you kind of mined for that data and saw what was kind of going on?
In the ED, we're only reviewing for HCCs right now. We're looking at expanding our other opportunities for expansion, mostly within our clinic when it comes to MIPS and those quality indicators that has been selected with certain, physician service lines. That's kind of where our focus are right now with our outpatient CDIS program.
Okay, great. No, that's fantastic. And I know that you had brought this up earlier, and it was definitely a big part of your presentation as it relates to, the key stakeholders and bringing them into your world and understanding their world, I believe was the line. Any suggestions on, is that more of, have you seen the success as far as pulling those key stakeholders in? I know you had mentioned it, Reggie, kind of more when you have a plan, but was that something that you did almost kind of piecemeal, one at a time as you were building things, or were there certain stakeholders that kind of aligned with each other, whether that be a clinic manager when you're unveiling kind of that dashboard as it relates to query, responses and unanswered queries, just that whole key stakeholder process, at least for me personally, I feel is where, in the past, certain outpatient programs kind of got stuck, and maybe wanting to bring everybody in all at once rather than, really identifying kind of what that proper process or protocol would be. And is that kind of the natural progression that you all have seen at UC Davis, that you're ultimately now pulling in just additional stakeholders as the program expands and you get into other areas?
I would say yes. I would say bring them in as your process evolves, when you're confident that wherever they intersect with your process is solid.
So wait for that moment, right? So you have a plan and kind of ultimately when you're passing the baton or what it is that they need to do at that point.
Yeah, if we had enlisted, say for instance, when Shirley was talking about her example with that clinic, If we had enlisted them early in our process, we weren't as well defined on what we were deciding. When Shirley had talked about our definitions, we hadn't defined our definitions as accurately as we could have in the beginning. And so as we evolved, we realized there were some of those things that need to be taken out. So the figures would have looked much worse if we were going to those clinics and saying, you know, all these were unanswered queries, but they actually ended up being withdrawn queries for whatever particular reason. So you don't want to go to them with this overinflated data that looks like their clinic's doing really poor, and then all of a sudden find out, well, I really shouldn't have been counting this against them. You're going to get a lot better buy-in from them if your data is very solid and you're very confident in your data.
Yeah, I
Got it.
think the answer to that is make sure your house is in order before you reach out to somebody else. So know that without a shadow of a doubt, what you're telling someone is accurate. So I think it should happen as early as possible once your house is in order.
No, that makes sense, right? You have the plan, you know, ultimately kind of what the roles and responsibilities are going to be, and as you alluded to earlier, Reggie, was more and again, what is it that I'm going to be able to provide for you, right? And not kind of over inundate that work queue, right? And really kind of have that plan and understand where kind of that carrot is for that to be an easier process for those involved, you know. And I know you had touched on it a little bit too, Reggie. Just you can get a lot of this stuff done, or at least the framework done with, I hate to say archaic tools, but you know, Microsoft Access, Microsoft Excel, a targeted approach. If you had to go manual RAF score, you know, really, you can get that traction as it relates to, you know, the validity of what's trying to be accomplished. If you kind of do it in that way and still only maybe have a limited amount of tools at your disposal, would you say that that's kind of an accurate statement, or definitely provides the building blocks for it?
That's an accurate statement. You would need somebody in a data analyst / clinician type capacity, somebody that understands both of them, but you could do it manually. You'd probably have to have at least one person devoted to that full time.
Got it.
To do that manual stuff, and possibly maybe even be the mailman for all the different, you know, notifications about when your queries are coming and that sort of stuff.
No, absolutely. And then
there's always
have
a
you all,
risk when you make a process dependent on a person, though.
that is very true. Absolutely, 100%, right? Garbage in, garbage out, or you know, good data in, good data out, right? You know, as it relates to the approach, have you seen the expansion from an ROI perspective, kind of, you know, funnel into other payers or, you know, commercial lines? Have you dabbled in, you know, Medicaid service lines at all as it relates to the outpatient side?
Not Medicaid, not yet. No, we're when we say our MSSP patient population, that's Medicare, traditional Medicare, Medicare risk predominantly.
Got it. And that was just a targeted approach, right?
Yeah, but the way that we're built, and if everybody keeps in mind scalability, you can scale up to whatever populations that you want. Once your process is solid and you have a team in place, you can make a business decision about, you know, how much bang for the buck are you going to get, and then you can add extra people as you want to scale.
No, absolutely. Anything as it relates to, you know, reconciling those RAF scores, you know, per care plans or anything like that as it relates to benchmarking those maybe separately, or what's the best way that you feel the process that you have in place as far as, you know, being able to reconcile those RAF scores accurately, you know, when you're closing them out?
Well, in our case, it goes back to, we keep using the tool Optum. We keep referring to it. You don't have to have Optum, but Optum, what it does is it allows us to benchmark against comparable organizations. So it completely answers the question that you just asked. If you were trying to do that manually, then I don't know if you could go to optum.com and look at their data on all the other organizations without being a part of their subscription service, or however that works. There's probably some type of benchmarking out there. It's just that since we had this tool available, we didn't investigate it any further than using the tool that we had.
Got it. And just kind of two more questions. One is it relates to, I think it's a really good question as far as, are coders, at the coding clinic, are they, providing the billable codes, or are the physicians, or how does that coding aspect happen within, your all settings?
Coding is done in the clinics by coders. They actually just rolled out a 3M professional fee type of product that they're using. So coding is actually doing the coding, not the physicians. And that's why we talked a lot about understanding their workflow and ensuring our query diagnoses is captured, because there is coders that's doing the coding.
Oh, fantastic. And then, just last overall question is it relates to, I know you've alluded to it as far as asking the right questions, right? And I'm sure that that can be isolated to the health system, particularly for itself, but any overall general asking of the right questions that you feel would kind of be uniform, or at least potentially uniform to any program that may be initially looking to kind of get started, any pitfalls that maybe can be avoided, or again just some of those early on additional questions, or asking of those right questions that maybe can point some folks in the right direction, and maybe just speed up kind of what they can do from a process standpoint, or from an implementation standpoint, by just some of those generalized right questions, if you will, to ask.
Well, some of the ones that Sherlivia mentioned are, identify your stakeholders. Who are my stakeholders? What is my workflow? And where do I intersect in that workflow with those stakeholders? I mean, those are some general questions that you need to ask before you even start. And then how am I going to identify my population? In our case, we chose MSSP, but you could choose all of Medicare, or you could choose, if you're a small organization, you could choose to view all of them depending on the size of your team, like every single visit. In our case, MSSP gave us a really good targeted population where we get a lot of bang for our buck.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Anything on that note, Olivia, outside of kind of maybe those bigger ticket item questions, anything as it relates to as you got into processes or anything like that, that would be just good, an overall generalized question to ask in that manner?
I think the biggest question too, if you're honing in on which population to review, is reaching out to your population health team. Most acute care hospital systems have them currently in place, and look at these categories that we discussed when it comes to HCC coding categories, and see what areas they find the most challenging, right? And I think that can actually help you understand where you need to focus your CDI program and help them understand how you can assist them. So I think partnering and working together with those key individuals, and even if you have clinics that's associated with your hospital, right? Most, again, healthcare, acute care systems do in some respect. So do you even know what they're doing with RAF scores? When at my previous institution, when I was really focused on inpatient CDI, when I would go and talk to some of the administrative leads for the physicians, I would ask about their RAF score, even though I was predominantly on the inpatient side. If you kind of try to understand their world, you'll be able to better understand how you can partner and assist them. So for me, it's about first and foremost understanding the big picture so I can ensure that I am focusing on the right things with my team. I think that's important.
I suppose one other overall question that ties to our particular presentation is, what tools do we already have? Because you need to look and decide what tools you have in place and decide, am I going to just go with these tools, or am I considering adding some tools, or that sort of thing? Because that's going to make a determination on your time frame too. If you think, okay, I can't start this program until I have X, well then you're going to set yourself up to wait until that particular tool gets implemented. So it's maybe a good idea to ask, what tools do I already have in place if you're wanting to get started right away?
That's good.
Yeah, no, That's a great point. I think that leads into, right, just being able to take those nibble bites to figure out kind of what's going on, but also still be able to focus on the longer term goal, the scalability, where does the program want to grow, but understanding you can't go from start to finish and take it all in one shot, right? You got to let the data do its work. You got to find out your workflows. You have to have, pull in key stakeholders at the right time when that process is understood. And then you can get into a lot of bigger and better things. But, as you alluded to earlier, Sherlivia, it's more about, keeping everything in your own house, right, tight and in order. And if you can do that in kind of those smaller segments and get those smaller wins and kind of build upon those items, you can really get to where UC Davis is now, where y'all are talking about, some major enhancements, automation, things like that. But there's been a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, I'm sure, that were put in to get it to that point. And a lot of folks along the way that assisted with being able to improve upon, those processes and always taking a look at it. So I think that gets missed in translation sometimes, or lost in translation, I should say. Again, we've seen it to where, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, outpatient CDI was a big buzzword, and everybody came back to their CFOs and wanted to go full bore on programs, and it just wasn't the right time. There's some that obviously have pushed through a lot of those headaches, but I think now there's just a much better understanding that you can have a very targeted approach, and you can start small. You can have those small wins and kind of build into those larger dynamics that folks are probably looking to do almost immediately. But it does take a lot of work to get there. So. Definitely appreciate both your all's time. Thank you for everybody for attending. As it relates, we will be having another event in March. We'll be launching that as it relates to our involvement with the Kentucky Actus chapter. So excited for some good news on that. And again, it'll take us about a week or two after we get all the information and edit the recordings and kind of get some follow-up information for everybody as it relates to the questions. All those that have registered will get that information. You'll get your sign-on to that web link, and then you'll have everything at your disposal as it relates to this presentation. But again, thank you, Reggie. Thank you, Sherlivia, Michigan and Indiana Actus chapters, for what we would consider a great knowledge and networking event. And I hope everybody has a great day.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.